Hello, welcome to the second of these videos, which is aimed at trying to provide you guys, students, with some support in your GCSE exams. The first video we focused on was on the civil rights movement and a specific question around the 50s and the 60s. This particular video is going to focus on still paper 1, but this time the second section of it. So that's the Cold War section. And it's going to focus on a specific 16-mark question around, and I've actually upgraded this particular video with a picture which says the main reason why tension increased during the early 1960s was due to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Do you agree? I should probably just add, if I can just get my pen, that this question would be worth 16 marks. Okay, plus 4 for SPAG. So it's a big question, okay? And in any question where you see 16 marks, you should be writing for about 20 minutes. And in an ideal world, you should be writing 4 paragraphs. 3 paragraphs which look at the potential arguments within that question, and a 4th paragraph that has a conclusion trying to link them together. Now, in reality, 4 might be a bit too much. So if you're feeling like you can't really manage 4 paragraphs in 20 minutes, which to be honest is fair enough, because remember that when I was 15, 16, if someone asked me to write 4 paragraphs, which is about a page and a half in that time, I'd really struggle. Then 3 will get you some decent marks. If you can do 4, that's fantastic. But if you can only do 3, then that's what you should aim for. Now, the first paragraph for this particular question should focus on the topic or the subject that you've been given in the question. So it should focus on Cuban Missile Crisis. And you should be explaining in each paragraph how that particular crisis led to increased tension. So if we start with looking at the Cuban Missile Crisis, what we should be doing in this first paragraph is explaining how the Cuban Missile Crisis led to increased tension. And there's several points that you could argue as to how it increased tension. The first one being that it almost led to a nuclear war. Both sides were days away from launching nuclear weapons with each other. And when missiles were placed only 90 miles away in Cuba from the Florida coast, it put the USA at high alert. They were on DEFCON 2, which is one step away from being at war. Equally, you could argue that the Cuban Missile Crisis led to an escalation of that period of 1960s tension, which started with the U2 crisis and somewhat ended with that particular Cuban Missile Crisis. So that's what you'd argue for the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, in that same paragraph, you could argue that the Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't in fact the main cause of tension, and in fact in some ways helped reduce tension. Now you'd say this by saying that actually both sides realised during the Cuban Missile Crisis how close they'd come to nuclear war, and as a result, following the Cuban Missile Crisis, what you saw was the period of détente. For example, once the Cuban Missile Crisis was over, the hotline was set up between the Kremlin and the White House so that the President of the United States and the Soviet leader could communicate. So that would be how you would say that the Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't maybe as big a cause of tension as first appears. Your next paragraph should then, so this is paragraph 2, should focus on one of the other crises that occurred during the 1960s. Now, common student mistake is where students don't read the question. Read the question. If I have any skills of any movie maker, I get the words. Read the question. Put there. As I don't, I'm just going to have to say it several times. Read the question. And in this particular instance, we need to be looking for the date. And lots of you are not looking at the date for questions. Alright? Make sure you read the date. If it says 1960s, you can't talk about anything that was before the 1960s. Otherwise, you just won't get marks for it. So let's just go over what you could be talking about in 1960s in terms of crises. You could talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, you're given that one. You could talk about the Berlin Wall, not blockade, wall. Or you could talk about the U2 crisis. There's something else you could talk about. You could talk about Czechoslovakia in 1968. But for purposes of this question today, we're going to focus on the Berlin Wall and the U2 crisis, as well as the Cuban Missile Crisis. So our second paragraph could be talking about the Berlin Wall and how that escalated tension. So if I was talking about the Berlin Wall, I would be maybe introducing my paragraph by explaining how the Berlin Wall was built in August 1961 because of the high numbers of people, East Berliners, moving to West Berlin to seek a better life, because West Berlin was benefiting from the Marshall Plan. There's 2 million people moved from East Berlin to West Berlin between 1945 and 1961. That's a key stat. 2 million moved from East to West between 1945 and 1961. Write that down. This caused Khrushchev to build the wall. Initially just some barbed wire, but later on as the time went on, the wall evolved to being a pretty secure barrier between East and West. Now, why this escalated tension was that it made Berlin a focal point of the Cold War. And it also separated East from West. It separated families who were split up. And the USA acted, verbally anyway, in support of the people who were living in Berlin and criticised the Soviet Union for having to build a wall around its population. This was exacerbated when Kennedy visited Berlin in 1963 and proclaimed near the wall, "Ich bin ein Berliner." So what he was trying to say there was, I am a Berliner. He is showing solidarity with the Berlin people. Now, I've read reports that actually this doesn't translate into I am a Berliner. What it really translates into is I am a donut, a type of donut. A Berliner, if you go to Berlin, is a type of donut. So he got this wrong, which is one of those curious incidents in history, which is quite funny. Anyway, by saying this, it angered the Soviet Union because he was showing support for West Berlin. But just like the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Berlin Wall has another side. Maybe it didn't increase tension, because maybe, in fact, it made things better. You could argue that the Berlin Wall, in fact, helped solve the problem of Berlin, because both East and West, both Soviet Union and the Western allies, NATO, agreed, essentially, that the East was the Soviet side and the West was the Americans and the British, and the other influences from the Western European countries have control of that. I always liken this to a group of siblings or a pair of two brothers or a pair of siblings who are sharing a bedroom. They're arguing about whose side of the room is whose. So that's like Berlin, East or West, which bit's mine. And what happens is that the parents decide to draw a line down the middle of the bedroom and say, that's your side, this is your side, that's it, sorted. You can't go on that side, you can't go on this side. And that's what happened in Berlin, essentially. They divided it, and in fact tension was in some ways reduced in Berlin because of that dividing line. There's never an issue now about who controlled Berlin. It was settled. It was divided between the two big superpowers. So that's how you'd argue about Berlin Wall. A third paragraph might be focusing on the U2 crisis. Now, the U2 crisis, just to recap, occurred when a U2 plane flying over the USSR, a U2 plane was a spy plane used by the Americans, was shot down by the Soviets and crash landed in the Soviet Union. Unbeknownst to Americans, the Soviets captured this plane as well as the pilot. Whilst the pilot was being captured, the Americans came out and said that this plane was not a spy plane. It was in fact just a weather plane, not flying over the USSR, but flying over Pakistan. Khrushchev, being the canny operator that he is, announced that not only did he have the plane, he had the pilot, who made a confession saying that actually was a spy and he was taking pictures of the Soviet Union, embarrassing the USA. But more importantly, in terms of tension for the Cold War, and this is what you would write in your essay, the U2 crisis increased tension during the Cold War as it ended peaceful coexistence. Now, this peaceful coexistence was this period of time before the U2 crisis where the two sides have been trying to get on a bit better. And what happened as a result of the U2 crisis was that a key summit, the Paris Peace Summit, which is a peace treaty agreement or a peace meeting, was cancelled. Khrushchev refused to attend this summit, and any chance of peaceful coexistence continuing was finished. Now, another thing you could add is that the U2 crisis and the humiliation that America faced as a result of it gave Khrushchev confidence to be more aggressive with the United States in the future. And a nice little thing you could add is that without the U2 crisis, the USSR might not have had the confidence to deal with Berlin in the way that it did in 1961, and in Cuba in the way that it did in 1962. Then, after doing those main 3 paragraphs, I then focus on my conclusion. And this is where you should try and draw the 3 events that you've just highlighted together. Now, how can we do this? It's quite tricky with this one. You just need to make an argument, really. I mean, you could say that the Cuban Missile Crisis was the biggest or the most important in terms of increasing tension, mainly because it almost led to World War III. You could argue that the Berlin Wall was the main focus of increased tension in the 1960s because it remained in place all the way through the rest of the Cold War, and Berlin remained a focal point for the Cold War until 1989 when the wall came down. My personal favourite is arguing about the U2 crisis and saying that in fact the U2 crisis is more important because it started that whole period of tension for real. Before that there'd been an attempt to have peaceful coexistence and things seemed to be getting better, even if that was just surface level. But from the U2 crisis, afterwards you see a gradual increase in tension to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And if it wasn't for the confidence that Khrushchev had gained during the U2 crisis, it's possible that the Berlin Wall and then the Cuban Missile Crisis would never have happened. And it's a lovely way to do history, that, if you are doing those counterfactual points. If one thing didn't happen, then this may not have happened either. So, after doing that, that's going to be the biggest question you have on the paper. But the top tips really I have for you is just make sure you read that question. Make sure you are looking at the dates. Make sure you are focusing specifically on the event it's giving you. This question is so important that you get right because it's worth so many marks. So really do spend some time on the exam on it. It's even an idea to do this question first in order to get it out of the way and get those marks banked. Okay? Too many people in our mock exams have been leaving this question till last and doing it in far too short a way, and therefore not getting more than 8 or 9. It's really important that you get at least 12 if you can on this. Okay. I hope you find this video useful. Hopefully we can do some more. And happy revising. See you later.